All right, welcome. Thanks for coming, those of you in person and online. So our session today is, we kind of changed up the name a little bit, but it's the same content. So student experiences of critical reflexivity as a threshold concept in undergraduate social work education. So I'll introduce us and then we'll introduce kind of the study, the research that we did. And then we'll take you through some of the things that we learned through our research. This study, I guess I want to give thanks to CITL because we had a TESI grant, so Teaching Enhancement Through Scholarly Inquiry, that supported us in this project. Meet the researchers. Okay, so first we have Kathy DeJong. I'm going to read Kathy's bio so that I don't mix anything up. Kathy is a second-generation Canadian settler of European descent. Prior to coming to MUN, she spent 23 years in Ontario, employed as a social work professional in the field of children's mental health. Kathy's area of scholarly interest is in critical mental health as it pertains to service delivery to 2S LGBTQIA+ youth and their providers. She is particularly interested in the lived experience of youth service users and how they have experienced the embedded heteronormativity in the service system. Similarly, she is interested in understanding how service providers experience the same and what they do to try and mitigate its impacts. All of this with a view toward creating a safer and more inclusive mental health service delivery system for all children, youth, and their families, regardless of gender and sexual expression or identification. Laura. So Laura Pacheco is an assistant professor at the School of Social Work here at Memorial, as well as an adjunct professor at the McGill School of Social Work. She has lived experience with disability and over a decade of community, praxis, and research experience in the field of parents and parenting with intellectual disabilities. Laura's research interests are around reproductive justice and mothering with a disability, intersection of parenting with an intellectual disability and the child welfare system, structural and intimate partner violence against women with disabilities, intercepting identities and social justice, aging and neurodiversity, critically reflective practice, and community engagement. I'm Kristen. I'm a practicing social worker in the community. It feels really weird to read my own bio, like I do know myself. So I'm a practicing social worker, but I'm also a term instructor with the School of Social Work here at MUN, and I'm also a PhD student at the School of Social Work here at MUN. I guess this whole concept of, or framework, I should say, of threshold concepts was introduced to me a couple of years ago when I was doing some education courses here at MUN. First, I didn't think it was a real thing, and then I guess I had like my own kind of light bulb moment, and then that learning has pretty profoundly changed how I teach over at the School of Social Work. So I'm really interested in continuing research in that area. And in my PhD, my research is actually going to be completely different, where I want to look at the experiences of cisgender parents who are parenting transgender children and youth. We had two research assistants help us out on this project. The first is Victoria Randall, who's actually not here today, but we still want to give her credit. She just recently completed all the requirements for her BSW and is just waiting to walk across the stage. She also has a Bachelor of Nursing from MUN. Victoria's been an RA on other projects, and she says her passions are working with people who use drugs, disability studies, epistemology, and social work and public education. And then finally, we have our second research assistant, Maria Lawler, who's part of our little panel up here this morning. Maria also presented a poster in the conference, so if you haven't seen it, it's over in the atrium there in the Bruno Center. Maria also just recently completed all the requirements for her BSW and is just waiting to convocate. She also has a Bachelor of Arts from MUN. This project was Maria's first experience being a research assistant, and she's interested in social work practice and continuing research in topics such as the ones that we explored in this study, as well as critical theories and social justice. So that's us. Now, Laura.
Good morning, everybody. So happy that you are all here today. We really look forward also to hearing your reflections in the work that we have done, and to hear how this may have implications for your work too. So we wanted to start by identifying threshold concepts and the main facets of it. So there's a broad definition of threshold concepts that it is a pivotal concept in a particular discipline like social work that allows a student to make sense of acquired information so that they can advance to a higher level of learning or understanding. And so Mayer and Land talk about 5 different components of threshold concepts. So the first one is related to a threshold concept being troublesome. So threshold concepts are complex. They, I can't see that, but meaning that it can create discomfort in the learner as they unlearn knowledge. So it can create some discomfort within them. The second one is that it is transformative. So once learners cross that threshold, so once they learn, it can be really difficult to unlearn. And this can affect their values. It can also affect their worldviews. And this can have an impact on their work out in the field. The third component of a threshold concept is that it is irreversible. So once the concepts are understood, it's difficult to, they're learned, basically, right? So the next component is that they are integrative. And learners really start to make connections in this new knowledge and are able to integrate it within this wider body of knowledge that they have been exposed to within their education. And knowledge is more cumulative than it is a linear process of learning. And the last concept is that a threshold knowledge is bounded. So it helps learners understand the boundaries of their own discipline or their own profession, what makes their discipline unique and differentiates it from other professions in the field. So that's the nuts and bolts of threshold concepts. So the next slide is related to the literature in the field. And what we know is that threshold concepts have been explored in higher education disciplines and across the health and social sciences. And a lot of these studies were underpinned by a positivist epistemology. There have been a few studies within the field of social work, particularly looking at social work education and the impact on practice or field. And critical self-reflexivity as a threshold concept is something that Foote talked a lot about. So Foote talked about the fact that critical reflexivity involves critically reflecting upon the impact of personal experiences on practice. Also talked about the notion that values and beliefs of social workers can influence social work and can influence practice, and that it's really important to be able to consider those broader social organizations, ideologies, and discourses that can impact, again, social work with families and communities and across the field. Foote also talked about the transformational component of critical reflexivity in that it transforms the way you think, the way you are, and what you become as a social worker as well. And it also goes beyond your role as a social worker. It can bleed into other parts also of your life. Another part of the literature is that it talks about generating complex knowledge in action and reflecting on action. So reflecting in action is the thinking and the reflecting that happens during. So thinking about your emotions and thoughts during the actual social work process, and reflecting on action usually takes place after the social work interaction where you're critically analyzing what did you use, what kind of an impact did it have on the person, and also on the session. And the last piece that came out of the literature is really the importance of continuous self-reflexivity. So even when students are done their education, it's really important they continue to use that in their everyday practice. So that was just a little bit of a summary of some of the research in this field.
Okay, so in the case of this particular study, the purpose, we aim to investigate the possibility that critical reflexivity is actually a threshold concept in social work education. And to do that, we investigated learners' understanding of critical reflexivity and any impacts it had on their learning experience. And we did this in one particular course, which Kristen, Laura, and I taught, and in which Maria was enrolled, and that was Social Work 2320, which is social work's knowledge and skills for interviewing and assessment. Okay, so we used a qualitative research design that included semi-structured interviews with 8 social work students who completed Social Work 2320. The questions that we asked were, how would you define critical reflexivity? Did critical reflexivity impact your learning experience in the social work program so far? Did critical reflexivity impact your sense of yourself as a developing social work professional? Did critical reflexivity have an impact on your life outside of your education and your role as a developing social work professional? Was there anything specific about Social Work 2320 that facilitated the learning? Do you believe your learning about critical reflexivity has had an impact on any of your other social work courses? And 7, do you have anything else to add about critical reflexivity that has not been discussed? So in the interview guide, each question also had multiple prompts to facilitate reflection and discussion. Interviews were recorded and transcribed. We then applied a generic qualitative analysis, coding transcribed interviews for emerging related themes. Participants were recruited by email. An email was sent to all learners who completed Social Work 2320 in the fall of 2022. A recruitment poster was attached to the email, and interested learners were invited to connect with a student research assistant, which was Maria, to express interest or ask questions about the study. Students were offered incentives for participating, which included a $20 gift card for the initial interview and participation, and a $30 gift card participation in the follow-up member checking that they did. Participants were interviewed at a location on the Memorial University campus, and interviews were conducted by someone other than their instructor.
So in terms of the data analysis, so within qualitative data analysis, researchers often, as many of you know, use both inductive and deductive approaches concurrently, but with different dominancy. So a deductive or a directed framework is used when previous research findings, theories, or conceptual frameworks regarding the phenomenon of interest exists. So we independently coded the transcripts. At least 2 of the researchers did that. And we began, and that was really using the categories that we already had that was based on what Kathy had identified in terms of those specific research questions. We then used an inductive approach for the remaining transcripts that was more related to identifying critical reflexivity because it was much broader and occurred at different moments of the interview and the transcripts. And so once we did that and we independently coded the transcripts, then we met together to talk about the codes, to talk about some of the discrepancies, and to then talk about our rationale and come together and come to a consensus on our codes.
Maria? So, from the interviews and the coding, we drew out 5 themes. The first one being defining critical reflexivity. The second one being impact on learning, and then impact on self in relation to social work identity, impact on self outside of the social work identity, and helpful pedagogy. So in relation to the first theme, defining critical reflexivity, students spoke about reflection and explaining this as reflecting back, questioning why you did what you did, what influenced your thinking and your actions, what judgments and assumptions you're making, and starting to notice patterns within your thinking as well. And then they went a step further than this and spoke about it in the sense of bringing critical thinking into the present moment, rather than just reflecting back on the things that you did or how you performed. So starting to become aware of your thinking about your thinking. Yeah. And then they also spoke about mindfulness. So being able to bring that awareness of your thinking into the present moment, not just looking back afterwards, and having that awareness of how your personal experiences, your social location, and your worldview impact you, and starting to become aware of your thoughts and the fact that they're always there. Students also referred to praxis, which basically is the idea that theory and practice are inextricably linked, which is a definition from the editors of the social work text, Critical Social Work Praxis. And the author defines praxis here as action and reflection upon the world in order to change it. In the interviews, we heard students talk about this idea of praxis that started to unfold for them alongside their growing knowledge and practice of reflexivity. And the mindfulness I just spoke about, already helps question why you're doing and saying the things you are, and you develop an ability to bring theory into your work and then subsequently into your practice. So you're becoming aware of the contextual factors and start to always consider the person in the context of their environment. And then lastly, students also defined critical reflexivity in terms of critical thinking and balance. So not just focusing on the word critical and its negative context, but also, highlighting your strengths and sort of how noticing your areas for growth help you also notice the strengths and skills that you do have. And there are a couple quotes that we pulled from students that kind of facilitate or help us understand what that all means. So one student said, "It almost feels like a giant piece of a puzzle, and it was so fascinating for all of us to realize that we all brought something different." And another student said, "Considering the world around you, how you saw it before and how you see it now and your place in it." And another student said, "This is just how I see things now," talking about the impact of sort of learning about critical reflexivity. And then another student said, "The conversations I have with myself internally are different now."
Okay, so with regard to impact on learning, the students discussed having increased confidence, which led to increased participation in the classroom. There was a reduction in fear associated with class participation. And reflexivity even occurred in relation to classroom interactions. Students spoke about the fear they had about taking up too much space in the classroom, or others spoke about interrogating why they felt the need to answer every question or participate in every discussion. They started unpacking the need to prove themselves in the classroom space. The other thing that they spoke to was the the impact on their learning was the transferability of it. So reflexivity became apparent in other social work courses as well for them. Students spoke about learning how they learn, which was impactful in other classroom settings. It led to challenging assumptions, different types of editing, and revision practices with submitted work. There were many self-realizations as well in terms of how they learned. So making these connections, noting your strengths and uncovering areas for growth was so much more impactful than having a professor point it out in feedback. It goes in your head a little bit more when you're noticing it yourself. Being able to make these observations increased retention of the material being taught. Students started to see things through a new lens, and they developed conscious competence, but also conscious incompetence. So they knew what they knew, but they also were aware of what they didn't know, which was a big piece of the learning curve for them, particularly in social work practice. And then this notion of praxis, which Maria defined and spoke to. So they considered theory with that same reflexivity. So you're forced to think about theory in the moment and start making a connection between theory and practice. You start making linkages between theory and practice, but also between different courses. And as has been repeated, it's largely about connection, right? So students spoke about how this shared experience of critical reflexivity increased a feeling of connection in the School of Social Work. They spoke about an atmosphere of collegiality. They were noticing what different people thought to situations and how different people would do things so differently. They learned from each other that way. And just a couple of quotes with regard to that. It goes into your head a little bit more. I need to do this next time. I need to do that next time. So just that whole process of consideration and self-consideration, right, is really impacted in terms of how they are seeing their learning. The elasticity of being able to learn a lot on a smaller amount of time. So, you know, being able to make those connections a bit quicker than they may have been beforehand.
That's me. So another theme that came out of the study was impact on self as a developing social worker. So the first sub-theme there was related to consciousness raising. And Kathy already touched upon this before, but the students talked about conscious competence, where they described the fact that they were aware of the skills that they were using, why they were using it, and when they were using this. And it seemed to have an impact on their confidence in using the skills within their practice. Conscious incompetence was also mentioned by the students as they became aware. Oh, sorry, that was an accent that came out there. From where, I don't know. They became aware of the skills that they didn't have, or that they felt they needed to continue to expand their skills as a social worker. But this seemed to increase their motivation to learn and to continue this growth throughout their courses. So another component of this theme was related to self-awareness. So they were able to identify how they became more self-aware, and that they were developing an expertise, but that they weren't experts, and that they felt as though the people they were working with were the experts in their own lives. It also facilitated internal dialogues and supported them to really think about their thinking. The increased self-awareness also connects with increased mindfulness. So they talked about really being able to be more and more present and allowing them to create a safe space within their practice, and acknowledging the uncertainty, particularly in social work practice, where We certainly don't always have the answers, and part of the goal is to be able to draw that out from the person you're working with. Empathy and perspective taking was also a theme, and this was related to self-compassion and increased empathy for others. So the students talked about how sometimes with critical reflexivity, there was a risk that they would overthink and overanalyze. And sometimes they saw that potentially as negative. However, they were able to increase their self-compassion and identify themselves as human and learning and growing to be able to manage that particular risk. Students also identified the importance of the bigger picture. So that was something else that came out of the process for students. And that meant that they were able to see people and their environments as they did the work. And that they also felt as though they were able to avoid that problem-solving trap and were able to be more present, be able to connect and value the importance of the relationship with the person that they were supporting in their assimilated patient. And I think Kristen will talk more about that. They also talked about being more able to understand what social work is and what distinguishes them from other fields. So for example, sociology or psychology. So they were really able to really hone in on what was unique about social work. And then the last component of this theme was related to increased motivation. So knowing what you know and what you don't know, as I mentioned before, facilitated motivation in the program, facilitated wanting to learn more, but also knowing that this is probably going to be what they would feel as they journey in this field. They talked about being proud of how much they had learned and wanted to learn more, and they felt that the critical reflexivity within their courses allowed them to be more prepared for their internships and potentially for the field of social work. And they felt that they had created a baseline for themselves by creating goals and really were able to identify throughout this process the kind of social worker that they wanted to be. So a few of the quotes that came out here. So the first student says, "The conversations I have with myself internally are different now." So you can kind of see that there's a shift that has occurred. And another student talks about the realization that through this process that this field seems to be for them. It's validating. Social work is what you're meant to do and you're on the path you should be on. And then the last student says, "I can see the bigger picture."
Okay, so we're down to our final two themes. So next we have impact on self, but outside their social work role. When I talk about threshold concepts to students trying to explain, like, what does that even mean? I find the best way to kind of say it really succinctly is that it feels like they're learning to be social workers as opposed to doing social work. And I feel like that's really what we captured here. So this whole idea of social working was one of the kind of sub-themes that came out here. Students speak about quote unquote social working people in their personal lives. So they're noticing that this critical reflexivity is following them when they leave the classroom. They talk about how their conversational patterns with people are different. They listen more, even like just with friends and family. They find that they're trying to fix less. A lot of social work students talk about how that's part of their personality, like they've become the person that their friends and their family go to when they're looking for advice or seeking a fix to a problem. And this whole concept of reflexivity helps them stop that a little bit and just focus on listening and supporting rather than fixing. They talked about changes in their parenting practices. So we have some students who are parents and they talked about the impact on that. And then other students reflected on even how they were parented and having some new awareness because of this critical reflexivity. They described a type of pervasiveness when it comes to critical reflexivity, that it shows up everywhere and they don't know how to turn it off. They talk about social working themselves, their friends, their family, just kind of everybody in their lives. And again, that speaks to me about becoming a social worker, right? They're not intentionally social working themselves or other people. It just becomes part of who they are. The next kind of sub-theme was asking why. So critical thinking and that idea of reflexivity, students can't turn it off. So they talk about watching their favorite television show and even seeing that through a new lens, asking why and considering context and just thinking a little bit deeper in terms of even when they're just trying to decompress and watch a TV show, they can't turn off that social work part of their brains. One student described it as an evolution of thought, and another student spoke about a shift in their thinking. So I feel like that captures it really well. They spoke about it being innate and embedded. So one student said, it's changed who I am. And another student spoke about how it's just part of who they are now. They talked about not doing it intentionally, but just not being able to turn it off when they leave the classroom. And they talked about how they notice it, like they notice these changes in themselves, but other people are also noticing it. So people in their lives are saying, you know, you've changed. Social work is changing you. You're different now than you were before. Some students will say, like their partners will say, stop social working me. Like they notice that there's some changes in the way that they converse. Students also spoke about how reflexivity applies retrospectively. So they're reflecting back on different experiences that they've had pre-social work and questioning, how would I do that now? What would I do differently if I could go back and do that all over again? Next, we saw some theme in relation to a change in their worldview. So they seem to see the world differently with this new level of critical reflexivity, how they make sense of world events, how they understand the world and also their place in the world seems to be really impacted by this idea of reflexivity. So they spoke about challenging their biases, considering their social location. And for a lot of students, that meant unpacking a lot of privileges that they had and they hadn't really ever been aware of. And then how that impacts who they are in the world and how they make sense of it. And then finally, it was relational. So again, I kind of alluded to most of this already, but students spoke about changes in parenting relationships, relationships with friends and family and romantic partners. And they also spoke about changes within themselves. So being more mindful, being more self-compassionate, having increased empathy, even just at the end of the day, they find themselves reflecting more, being more curious, and feeling confident to kind of challenge themselves, but also to challenge other people. So they're noticing when other people maybe haven't done that kind of reflecting in terms of their privilege or their worldview, students are challenging them to do that a little bit now, which was new and different for them. So just a couple of quotes to kind of let you hear what we heard from the students. So they said, once it's turned on, it's always turned on. It's the things that get stuck in your head. This is just how I see things now. And then another student kind of took it one step further and suggested it rewires the way your brain works. It really speaks to the transformation that they felt they were experiencing. And then lastly, we were really interested in what exactly was it about this course that facilitated all of this learning and growth for our students. So in 2320, we used simulated patients. So this was a partnership between the School of Social Work and the Munn School of Medicine. And I'm going to pull up my notes just because I want to make sure I get the titles right. So it was the Clinical Learning and Simulation Center. So we partnered with them, and myself, Laura, and Kathy worked really closely with them and came up with a case. So a simulated case that our students in Social Work 2320 would have an opportunity to work with this mock client, mock service user, throughout the duration of the course. So we put them in groups of 4 or 5. They were in the same group for the whole course, and they were able to interview this simulated patient 3 different times. So we would teach them skills in the classroom, and then they would have an opportunity to practice those skills with the simulated patient. In our interviews with our research participants, students spoke about how truly impactful that whole experience was. Just the whole opportunity to be able to engage with simulated patients. Typically, we would rely on like the professor or the instructor playing the role, right? Assuming the role of a service user. Or we would have students interview each other where they would take turns playing the role of a social worker or a service user. And students spoke about how the simulated patient experience was far superior to any other kind of creative ways we could do role playing in the classroom. Most students said that this was one of the most impactful learning experiences that they had ever had in relation to the simulated patients specifically. They spoke about it being as close to real life as you can get. And they also said that they liked interviewing in groups. So they were able to learn from each other, right? They were able to practice their skills, but also then were noticing how different people were hearing different things or choosing to go in different directions. So they felt that the group interview setup was also really helpful. Then we had reflection papers. So I'm giving you a little bit of a rundown of what our course is structured like. After each of the 3 interviews, our students had to then write a reflection paper. So they weren't graded on how well they performed in the interview. We asked them to really reflect on how they think they did. What skills did you use? Did the skills come as easily as you thought they would? Things that you thought would come naturally, was it more challenging? And we asked them to write, I mean, it wasn't a long paper, but 3 or 4 pages, I think, to reflect on how they think they did. And we really encourage them to have a balanced reflection, right? So what are your areas for growth? What were you surprised about? But also, where did you do really well? Did you surprise yourself and use a skill that you thought would be more challenging to use? So students spoke about the reflection papers being really helpful because it forced them to reflect back, right? To consider how they did in those interviews. In the papers, they reflected on their social location, their skills, their growth, and then their goals in this particular course. They said the papers truly forced them to reflect regularly, to consider what they were doing right and wrong, was how the students explained it. And it forced them to think about their thinking, but then also to be able to name it and explain it and describe it to somebody else. They said the assignments were something that made them dig deeper. And they said they were thinking about what they did, why they did it, and then what they might do differently. Once they wrote those papers, we decided we weren't going to grade them. So we implemented an ungrading principle in this course. We called it self-grading in the syllabus, and that's how we explained it to the students. So we provided them with a rubric. And then once they've completed those reflection papers, we asked them to grade themselves on their ability to be reflective. So again, they're not grading themselves on how well they performed in these interviews, but in their ability to know where they did really well and where maybe they need to spend some extra time in terms of growth. They spoke about this facilitating learning as they were forced to reflect on their performance and their reflection. They said that it increased awareness as they were reflecting on the reflecting. And they said that this level of critical reflection was more impactful for them than simply hearing feedback from us as their instructors. So they felt like they learned a lot more through this ungrading reflection process. Those were the 3 main impactful kind of pedagogical approaches that students spoke about. They did also talk about other things in the classroom, so different classroom discussions and different activities. So the students spoke about, so it was myself and Kathy and Laura, and each student spoke about things that each of us did differently, but things that created safety in the classroom. So they felt like they could be vulnerable, and they talked about the impact of that and how helpful that was for learning. They spoke about different videos that we used, different activities that we did, and different practice wisdom that we would share. So the 3 of us happen to have a lot of practice experience as social workers, and students spoke about hearing from us as being really impactful. And then finally, the idea of collegiality. So students shared that they learn from each other. Doing those interviews in the group context seemed to really facilitate a lot of that. And then they also talked about how they felt accountable to their group members. So they did the interview together, so they were motivated to do as good as they could do because what they did impacted the other members of their group. So it increased motivation for students as well. They gave each other feedback, which they found really helpful. They engaged in their own reflection as part of the course structure. But then, of course, even though we didn't grade their assignments, we did still give them feedback. And students spoke about how the combination of doing the interview, reflecting on the interview, giving themselves a grade, and then hearing from the professors created, seems like a real incubator for a lot of really rich learning in this particular course. I think I've already told you all the quotes. Students said the course and the assignments just simply get you to dig deeper. They felt like they were reflecting on the reflecting, kind of like thinking about your thinking, and described simulations as being one step closer to the real world. So I guess just to try to tie it all together, we started the presentation with an introduction to the threshold concept framework and the 5 different criteria that like a learning objective has to meet in order for it to be considered a threshold concept. And we feel like the information that we learned from our students suggests that critical reflexivity would be a threshold concept in social work education. So they spoke about the troublesome aspect of it, that it was a new and novel way of thinking, feeling, and being. They spoke about the discomfort. It wasn't necessarily a fun process for them. So there was some discomfort during and after the learning. They spoke about the integrative part of it, that the learning was transferable. And we heard from them that it helped them prepare for field, which is a big deal for us in the School of Social Work. And that it ultimately changed their worldview, which is a pretty big statement to make. They talked about the transformative nature of it, that you can't turn it off, that their worldview has shifted permanently, and that their relationships have changed, that it's irreversible. You can't go back to how you used to think. That way of thinking is no longer accessible. And then the bounded nature of it. So social work does interprofessional education here with MUM, where they work with other health professionals. And students spoke about how they were able to see how their role stands apart from other disciplines. So what makes them unique as compared to other helping professions. So yeah, we feel like it definitely meets all those criteria.
And so I guess for us as instructors, the main takeaways that that we've taken from this project is that the use of critical reflexivity results in an overall richer learning experience for students. Reflective learning assignments are impactful for the learners. Ungrading or self-grading, that approach to evaluation was impactful for both the learners and the instructors. It was interesting for the 3 of us in terms of how we had to grade. It was a really light touch. We had to experience some students maybe not being as aware of their level of their skill level and rating themselves higher than maybe we would have, and some lower. And then you had to trust that process, that over the time that they would have that realization. And by the end of the term, there was more of a accurate self-assessment. And that the use of simulation-based learning in a practice-based course contributes to a much richer learning environment for the learners. And we can also speak to that, as the 3 of us taught it the year previous without the SP and without the changes. And I think this was a much better learning experience for us as instructors and for the students as well.
So the last slide is really a quote, and it is a quote. I'm going to stand up because. And so this is a quote from a participant in our study, and we felt as though it really summarized the essence of the responses, and also spoke to us as instructors, as social workers and researchers within the field, that we have been changed on all these levels as well, and will continue to that journey of transformation on to our other courses and also in other facets of our life. So the student says it impacts ways of doing, but also being. So that really immersive part of threshold concept. I think that critical reflexivity impacts how you approach or show up to the learning environment. So not only to our classroom, but to different educational settings. So we are so happy that you are here. Look forward to hearing your reflections and how this may tie into the work that you're doing or would like to do, or just any reflections or comments that you may have. Thank you so much for being here this morning with us. Any questions?
It's not so much a question, but I just wanted to comment and say, like, I have a few friends that have done social work in the last few years, and they have actually talked about this and how impactful it's been. So
Thank you.
That's good.
Yeah, because our sample was 8 students, so we can't necessarily generalize, but certainly that's important to hear. Thank you.
Very affirming. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question. What would you do if you got to the end of the semester and you had a student who still was evaluating themselves quite differently from how you?
Well, we have. That's not. So this course 2320, there's a second course called 2321. They run concurrently. So you hope that in 2321, with more reflection and more sort of experience of practicing skills, that sort of self-awareness continues to grow over that semester. Because in 2321, we have in fact integrated the standardized patient into it, not as a person coming in, because we don't have the funds to do that, but the assignments. We asked them to rethink about Minnie, who's our standardized patient, in the assignment, but we've also integrated their partner into the assignments in 2321. So it's kind of, the hope is that as they learn other parts of becoming an interviewer, and then some of that self-awareness comes. For example, one of the things we talk about is preparatory empathy. We don't talk about that in the first course. And so we asked them to put themselves in the client's shoes, which I found was a pretty powerful exercise for realizing, hey, I have some biases here. I didn't realize I had those biases here. Maybe we saw those biases when we read their initial papers, but now they're realizing them. And again, as as the students talked about, self-realization goes way further than your prof saying, hey, I think you're being a bit narrow there, right?
Mostly what we saw was like a little bit of grade inflation. And that was really hard for me to be okay with, which is why it was transformative for me as well. But we did still see growth. So the self-grading was 45% of the course, so it wasn't the whole course. And I gave a lot of feedback, but it wasn't necessarily feedback on the grade as much as it was feedback on their reflection. So I had to wrap my head around being okay with their grade being a little higher than I would have given it. And I was okay with that as long as I was still seeing the growth.
Yeah, and I think this is something that we talked about, in that the self-grading was really based, part of it was to sort of think about your skills and the skills that you use in the interview. But the other part of it was to critically reflect. And so it wasn't just about, the performance was just a small part of it too. So I think that's also something that we kept talking about, and how the critical reflexivity that they learned in that assignment is part of an important skill set in our field. So to be able to take that and continue to expand on that was the goal. But certainly we had many conversations about it, right?
Yeah, it wasn't an easy switch for me.
Any other questions before we wrap up?
Well, no, I was going to follow up on the same kind of question. I'm coming from medicine, but we have slightly different, but some of the similar challenges, and we're actually reflecting on that at the moment. Whether we're doing what we hope to do.
Mm.
Encourage the students to gain that ability for self-reflection, as well as understanding the non-biomedical aspect.
Yeah.
Of
Yeah.
disease, right? This is coming to health.
Yeah.
It's a different format.
Yeah.
So it'd be really interesting overall. How you design the courses overall and how you integrate that.
Yeah.
Similar to your question, I think a bit, there is always that concern. Ultimately, if you're helping, you're supporting practitioners to develop into future practitioners. And sometimes there are professionalism issues or something. That they don't want to
Absolutely.
do something. So how do you integrate?
Managing that.
Managing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always like, I think as instructors, it's a reflection for us. We've got a process. Are we doing it right? Are we doing it not?
Yeah.
Does it work? Does it not?
Do you want a real honest answer to that?
I think
The
same as us.
Yeah. The experience that we spoke about here was the pilot run, right? That was the first year we ran this kind of ungrading in that particular course. I chose to do it a little differently in the subsequent year, where I had a little disclaimer in the syllabus that said, your grade needs to be plus or minus 10% what I would have given you. So if I read a paper and I think they really missed it, they didn't do what they needed to do, there's significant issues here, and they gave themselves an 85, and I would have given them a 65, then they get the 65. So I put that little extra layer of accountability in there. I didn't actually have to change anybody's grade, but I found with that little disclaimer in the syllabus, the grades were more realistic. I had less inflation in the grades because they knew I was still grading it. I still had expectations. And they would only get the grade they gave themselves if it was realistic. So I found it kept them more honest. And I did that. I don't think Kathy didn't do that, but I had a harder time letting go of that. And I did, I found it helpful.
So what I did not in 23-20, but in 23-21 was we had integrated a skills lab component. And so I expanded mine to be the main portion, half the class, where they would do a live skills demo in front of their peers. And so part of the feedback, so to take the focus off performance, I gave them all the same grade for actually doing it. It was a participation grade, right?
Mm.
But the feedback was not only from me, but they had a group they worked with who provided feedback, and then the larger class did. And this, what the students talked about at the end of that process, now that's only happened once, it was a much richer experience because they got to see each other work. They got to see how people did certain things one way where they would have done it a different way. And it really made them to think more critically about who they were and what they were doing as social workers.
Yeah, there's something about the use of standardized patient. I mean, in fact, they may use them all,
Yeah.
but for very standardized parts of the examination. Or like, don't really, we do and we don't. It's an interesting thought, and that ability to interview in groups.
Yeah.
How many students do you have per? How large is each cohort?
We had, there's about 100 students in total, so we had 5
It's
sections.
similar.
Yeah,
And then it also.
How do you manage the?
yeah.
How do you do something?
Yeah.
That quality, with that level of quality.
Yeah.
Intrinsic with such a large.
Yeah, definitely some challenges there. And I found it exhausting, I will say.
That's
Like I said this to them as we were preparing for this, you would like plan ahead for your class and think, oh, I don't have to plan a lecture. I don't have to have, I'm just gonna go in and sit and listen. No, it was the most exhausting
Yeah, it really was.
classes throughout the semester because you're trying to give them so much quality feedback, right? So it's constantly taking notes. We gave them the option to take a timeout. So
Yeah.
take a little bit of that pressure off so that if they took a timeout, it was that teaching in the moment, like getting them to reflect, okay, what did you just ask? Where are you thinking you want to go next? What's kind of stopping you? What are you reading from the client? What are they giving you in terms of their body language or their tone or whatever? So yeah, it was like that classroom management piece in the actual interviews was really intense.
So, and one thing, the last thing I'll add to is in terms of the SPs themselves, It's not the same process as they do in medicine, right? And the SPs talked a lot about that, right? Where it wasn't as black and white, where they had actual, like, we had SPs break down and cry and like legitimately cry in the sessions. Because there was just that element of it that's not, you try to standardize it, but you just can't. Right?
No, I imagine that's what I mean, usually we give a scenario, I have got limited experience with the standardized patients, but. So I hear it both ways, but, the whole part about there's a scenario and then the rest they can bring in their own life.
That's right.
But we don't really, we engage with that, but not too much. We'd ask the medical students to engage with that, but not too much. Whereas imagine you're
Really want to go, yeah, we asked them to go there.
We do, yeah, and we provide them with a script based on our psychosocial framework, but students will often go beyond that, right?
Yes.
Okay, we're just about out of time, but we have someone who's been waiting very patiently.
So this course is about assessment, right?
Yeah.
And you're working with a simulated patient, standardized patient?
Yeah.
All right. I'm interested in knowing how you prepare the students for this. So create a scenario. Let's say we have a person that we're interested in working with who is a survivor of child sexual abuse. What happens with survivors is they act out, right? So the act out can be pretty intense, and they usually end up in the medical. Now, psychiatry usually gets to them ahead of us, and they drop them. So here you are, you're simulating the patient. He's staring back at you with the Prozac stare, and you're trying to reach him. Do you work with the students to help them learn how to do that?
I don't know that we do that in 2320 specifically.
IP, they do.
Because that is, like this course that we did, the simulated patients,
Yeah.
that's like they get into the social work faculty, they start day one, they're in this course. So this is the most beginning, basic kind of introduction. So it's interviewing and assessment. We're teaching them how to ask an open-ended question versus a closed-ended question, how to pick up on tone of voice. We certainly do, considering the context, starting with where the service user is at. But specifically in relation to someone who's medicated, I don't know that I've necessarily covered in that course. I would imagine it's covered in other courses, like the mental health course.
I think in in the IPE units that are attached to the families course, it's about an elderly, it depends whether you get the female or the male patient who's on a number of medications. And so I think that from that perspective, because it's IPE and there's medical students there and there's social work there and psychology's there, that's where you're talking to those issues, and where social work might challenge psychiatry, for instance, about the medication as being, stopping that patient from experiencing what's going on in their life. I think that's more of a forum for where those types of things happen, rather than certainly not. We set up our scenario to be as easy as possible because they're brand new students, right? We've even just a few twists and turns by putting in, no pronouns, right? Or we wouldn't, this person uses they pronouns as opposed to she pronouns. It would spin their head for a bit to try to figure out, how do I address them, and are they non-binary? And so we kind of threw some stuff in, but not the medication thing.
I think the mental health course talks about like the MAD studies course would prepare students more for that, but not every student gets to
Not
know.
with an SP though, right? You don't have an SP in.
No,
No.
but I guess like you could transfer.
Yeah, for sure. No, absolutely. Yeah. No,
I think,
yeah.
I don't know, I really want to look into psychiatry. I don't know if there's any SB use of as standardized patients for that kind of
For psychiatry.
issue. For psychiatry, for that, or for psychiatry in general, and for And for that kind of issue, because it would be very complex to do, right? Because either you have, say, you have someone who has lived experiences close enough, but then there's the risk of triggering.
Yep.
Re-experiencing others,
For sure.
or you don't, and in which case some of those things are going to be really hard to mimic.
Yeah, I think our hope, like, ultimately was that because students talked about this idea of praxis and being critically reflexive in their praxis. So we're teaching them basic skills, how to interact with people, how to engage, how to ask questions, how to be supportive. And our hope is what Maria said, that when you then go into a mental health course and you learn about all these different scenarios, that you bring that reflexivity with you, right? So, okay, mad studies theory would tell me this person is looking at me, you know, in this way. I know they have this medication. What's my best approach here? How am I going to engage with this person? So I think it's that transferability of the skills that we're teaching that we're really hoping for,
So 46 training.
which is,
The mental
Yeah.
health, critical mental health.
I've got just, the simulated patient seems to have no issues.
no issues. Oh no, our simulated patient comes with pretty complex, they're a survivor of intimate partner violence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The kids have been in care, they're involved
Kids
in
were in care,
PSSD,
childhood trauma,
Yeah, lots of losses throughout
Yeah.
their life,
potential
gender,
alcohol issues. Yeah,
learning gender, some
learning gender.
addictions.
isolation.
Yeah. We didn't give you the whole rundown. But we can, if you're interested in kind of, in looking at the actual case that we've created, you're welcome.
Yeah, you're welcome. to look.
Yeah, I'm prepared.
Probably should
Yeah.
interrupt. I had one job. Such an interesting discussion. I'd like to everybody join me please in thanking our presenters. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you for your moderation.